Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
Jason Furman has committed himself to policy. There are a few others equivalent to him, both Republican and Democrat. He's associated with Democratic politics, but he's, I think, been ecumenical, to use a word that Professor Furman uses a lot. Paul, one of the key things with Jason Furman is he was voted most handsome freshman on his dorm at Harvard. He beat out his roommate just by a little bit. That would have been Matt Damon from a few years ago. Jason, thank you so much for joining us this morning. You're in Act 10, and you have to teach ambiguity, microeconomic ambiguity, and it can go this way and that. What I didn't hear from the Secretary of Treasury is the risk of a real or nominal GDP slowdown with all the policy upset the nation faces right now. Do you see that we could have a lessening of real GDP or the animal spirit of nominal GDP?
Yeah, well, right now, the level of uncertainty is just incredibly high. That is definitely a minus for the economy. I don't know how big a minus it is, and a lot of it depends on how the uncertainty ends up getting resolved around things like tariffs, or whether it gets resolved. It may be that every month there's a new threat, it gets withdrawn, a new threat that gets made. That makes it hard to do planning on a global basis. And that's the success of American corporations, is their global reach.
Well, help us with the equation then, because everybody focuses on consumption. We do the Fed parlor game. I was amazed we didn't talk, the independence of the Fed here. We'll talk about that in a moment with Professor Furman. But ignored, Jason, as you know, is the I in the equation, business investment. As you look at CPI and analyze it, how do you analyze business investment right now in America?
Yeah, so consumer spending is the majority of GDP, but investment is the majority of fluctuations in GDP because it's much more volatile. And right now, investors, business investment is grappling with continued high interest rates, which are likely to stay that way, with an appreciated dollar, which is likely to stay that way, with uncertainty about global trade, which is likely to stay that way. On the other side of the ledger, there may be some reductions in investment, in regulations. That'll matter more in targeted sectors like energy than it does generically across the board. So a lot of cross currents right now, but from policy, they're a little bit more minus than plus on that part of GDP that is most critical to business cycle fluctuations.
Professor, the Federal Reserve is obviously focusing on inflation, and inflation was a big issue in the recent presidential election. Certainly, are you concerned that inflation and some of the policies that the Trump administration is talking about, whether it's tariffs or changes in immigration policy, could fuel another round of inflation?
I think it's certainly possible, but let's define what we mean by another round of inflation. Right now, I believe underlying inflation is around 2.5%. And the tariffs that have been done to date on China and steel will probably add about 1/10 of a percentage point to that. If you do another big set of tariffs, maybe it adds 3/4 of a percent to that. Now you might be at 3% inflation. That's a big deal for the Fed. That means they're not cutting rates. It might mean, depending on their theory about whether or not to look through the price level change, that rate increases are back on the table. But that isn't necessarily a huge thing that consumers take note of. I don't know how much humans notice the difference between 2.5% and 3% inflation, but the Fed certainly does.
Right. Professor, you and I think much of our audience grew up with this whole concept of internationalism, globalization. Is that still a thing these days, or is kind of everybody just kind of trying to onshore or friendshore everything these days?
Look, I'm unapologetic in my enthusiasm for globalization. It's done enormous things for American consumers, American producers, the strength of the United States. There's no question that politically it's on its back heel right now, but it is such an incredibly powerful force that to me, it's much more like a dandelion that will grow no matter what the conditions are than it is like a fragile orchid that needs to be watered in just the right way. And look, there's been some feedback in the system. If we had tried to put 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico, it would have been horrible for the U.S. auto industry. I think that might be part of why it didn't happen and part of why I hope it doesn't happen.
Jason Furman with us, folks, on your commute across the nation. Good morning. I'm Bloomberg Surveillance and on YouTube. Thank you for letting us be in your living rooms, your offices as well. Even some people in their cars watching. Sure. I don't know. I'm not sure about that. Jason, I got to go back to where we are. I want you to take a bigger picture here. Like, look at the Washington Post, look at the cacophony of Bloomberg opinion, et cetera. I got Treasury secretaries. I mean, I know you go back to Albert Gallatin. Forget about that. I got Robert Rubin and a guy named Summers who used to sign your paycheck. I got Jack Lew. I got James Baker and company. I mean, the Treasury Secretary is at the fulcrum of our executive, legislative, and frankly, judicial branch of making it work within our financial system. Are we at risk now that that financial system has run out of the Oval Office? Do we have a Treasury Secretary who's so diminished that he really can't affect Furman-like policy?
I hope not. Scott Bessent is a smart guy. He's a talented guy. If this policy making were delegated to him, I wouldn't agree with all of it, but I wouldn't worry fundamentally about being in deeply unsafe hands. But yeah, the tariff calls are being made out of the Oval Office. The calls about the Fed are being made out of the Oval Office. You see Scott Bessent one moment saying, we're comfortable with the Fed because we're focused on getting down the 10-year, which is a great thing to say. Absolutely makes sense. Right. And then the next moment you see Donald Trump commenting on the Fed funds rate, seemingly oblivious to the 10-year.
We're going to rip up the script right now. We could do this with the future vice chairman or chairman of the Fed. Could you see Governor Furman?
Sure.
Come on, let's cut to the chase, Jason, right now. We're beginning to see the percolation. I don't want to editorialize here, folks, of Fed independence. We go back to McChesney Martin. We go back to LBJ, where he took McChesney Martin's ears and picked them up like the dog back then. Jason Furman, is this Fed at risk of its independence?
Look, I'm nervous. So far, I'm a little bit reassured. They had a sweeping executive order about independent agencies and presidential control, and they explicitly included an exception for monetary policy and for the FOMC. It's also hard for them to do anything about it because he only gets 2 appointments over the next 4 years. I hope the courts would not let him fire Jim Powell with no reason. But I'm nervous. To me, it's a tail risk. It's not the most likely scenario, but this is the best economic institution we have. So, 2% chance something happens to it, we should be concerned.
In your youth, you had to carry water from the executive branch over to Capitol Hill. How do you frame in your head that the legislative branch, when they choose to, rebuts a unilateral Trump policy? Do you see this as given committees? Like I think of armed services and Putin. I'm making this up, folks. Stay with me. But Jason, the basic idea is, what's the Furman mechanism of how the legislative branch responds to this moment in our history?
Look, when your party's in power, you're frustrated by checks and balances. You're like, why can't we do everything we want to do? Then when the other party's in power, you're like, hey, I appreciate these a bit. I don't want them to be able to do every single radical idea that they want to do. And, I think you're going to see maybe less checks and balances than I might like coming from Congress, but still a decent amount of them. And some of that inertia is bad. It means we're not going to get done things we should get done. But a lot of that inertia is the inherent conservatism of the American system, where you don't make large, radical, dramatic changes, because conservatives themselves, since Burke, have understood that that's a recipe for all sorts of problems.
Jason, as you sit back here and you look at some of the economic trends, economic data points coming out here, what is the biggest economic concern for you for this U.S. economy?
I just have the conventional one, which is this stubborn, persistent inflation. And 2.5% underlying inflation, if it's down 0.3, we're golden. If it's up 0.3, we're in a certain amount of hurt, and everything else is humming along basically just fine, assuming we don't have very disruptive policies.
Thank you so much for your interest across the nation today on YouTube. We are commercial free in this hour. A conversation with the Treasury Secretary, with our Anne-Marie Horton. We're honored to bring you Jason Furman from Harvard University. Wendy Schiller will join us from Brown University in a moment. Never in the history of media has there been a joint conversation, Harvard then Brown, Brown then Harvard.
Exactly.
And we're not asking either of them about the hockey game.
The hockey,
today.
exactly.
Furman has tickets. You should see where they are. One more question, please, to Professor Furman. Paul Sweeney.
Professor, Ec 10, Principles of Economics. How do you frame out in the tariffs unit? What do you talk about about tariffs? How do you teach that? What's your thoughts there?
Look, I'm nervous about that. I'm doing that in about a month. I'm going to do it the same way that I've taught.
Tom and I will come up.
Same way that I learned it decades ago. But it's going to sound like a rebuttal to Donald Trump. Every single sentence is going to sound like the only reason I'm saying it is because I want to contradict him, when the only reason I'm saying it is that's what's been in the textbooks for a long time, and it's been in the textbooks for a long time for very, very good reasons, some of which were even grounded in things like accounting identities, which I'm 100% sure are true, and not every comment President Trump makes respects them.
Do you have a magnitude tip point on percent of tariffs? Just ad hoc. I'm talking Krugman, Furman here. Bring over like Glenn Hubbard, even in Columbia. Jason Furman, is there a percentage tip point where a blended rate of 2-3% comes up and it's oops? Where's that number?
Matters a lot who they're on. Canada and Mexico matter just so much more than any other country. You do 10% tariffs even on the two of them, and an awful lot of the way U.S. business is conducted, U.S. employment happens, gets disrupted, frankly, to the benefit of a number of other countries.
Jason, thank you so much for your generous time this morning.